put some notices in the Village Voice, and we had a notice in the New York Law Journal, and a few people responded to those, and we had an organizing meeting in my apartment with about 10 people, of whom about half were law students, and there were a few lawyers, and then there were 1 or 2 people who were looking to date lawyers. So, they were sort of interlopers.
I was just a law student, so I was hosting actually as a law student first year. It was pretty phenomenal, actually, if you think about it.
For a few years, it was basically a social group, and I took care of maintaining a mailing list and sending out monthly mailings. We called it the New York Law Group, to have a nice closeted name, because people didn't want to have anything like gay in the name. People were very closeted in the late 1970s.
When I was coming out of law school, I was very clearly told by folks in the placement office to have 2 resumes. And the idea was you would have a resume where you were out and a resume where you weren't out.
We had a lot of career problems back then. So we wanted to have a place to be supportive and take care of each other. And it morphed over not that long a time into a real public service organization where it was all of us doing something for everybody.
The transformation that we've seen now and over the 40 years of LeGaL's existence has been just remarkable.
In 1980, I started slipping news items into the monthly meeting notices that I was mailing out, and that evolved into the newsletter, which we now call LGBT Law Notes.
He started writing the law notes. This was a risky business for him. He very courageously went ahead. He felt we needed to know, and now you know how widely LeGaL's publication is of that.
The gay rights bill was first introduced in the City Council early in the 1970s, and it came up year after year after year. Then LeGaL was invited, and so as president of LeGaL, I got to testify. And this was the year that it finally passed, in 1986.
Is there any time in history of civil rights legislation that we have legislated laws dealing with their lifestyle?
Yes. And I would submit, for example, Councilman Deere, that if there was discrimination against people who wore yarmulkes, that is an issue of lifestyle. And the U.S. Supreme Court has been dealing with that issue. And that's an aspect.
You're some attorney. Not being an attorney, I can tell you that falls under religion. I'm talking about, is there a time that you have legislated for lifestyle? If you're an attorney, you should know that.
I want to respond to your question. When Title VII of the Civil Rights Act was passed, religion was interpreted to mean just belief. And then the Civil Rights Act was amended to add religious practice to protect people who followed a certain lifestyle because of their religious belief.
In 1984, we recognized that we needed to become the Bar Association for Human Rights of Greater New York. And then in 1994, we again changed our name to LeGaL, which more represents who we are now today.
When I was working at a law firm and I realized this is not what I wanted to do with my life and I was trying to figure out my next step, I pulled out my LeGaL newsletter, and all of a sudden I saw an advertisement in the LeGaL newsletter for a job working with an out lesbian judge. I said, this is a job I have to apply for. And it was Joan Lobis. I interviewed with her and we bonded over both being lesbians and both having Wheaton Terriers, and she hired me for the job.
What really spurred us to organizing as a bar association was the AIDS epidemic.
There were people that had AIDS and they were being kicked out of their apartments. People were discriminating against them. George Terzian had already started at the community center a clinic. One night a week you would go there and people would come who were having problems with AIDS, and we were starting to, I guess, learn that impact because we really had not a sense of what was about to happen.
The really horrible decades of the AIDS epidemic, where we lost an entire generation of leaders and lawyers, including people who now might well be the leading judges of my generation. Having organizations in the community like LeGaL that helped people find lawyers to do bedside wills and bedside powers of attorneys, and just really provided those emergency services, really stands out in my mind.
My earliest memory of LeGaL was a program that we were planning called If There's a Will, There's a Way. And the reason we had this program was because this was the height of people dying from AIDS. There was no such thing as even marriage being a thought. And the idea was to allow people who were very ill or dying to have some control over their not only their estates, but the planning for their health and for other issues in their life.
The law clinic actually was part of LeGaL from very early on. It was totally just a few people volunteering. It wasn't even, it was before we had any not-for-profit entity. People just did it on a volunteer basis. It was just people who wanted to do something good for people who couldn't afford a lawyer.
The main impetus was having a referral service and setting up a pro bono committee to provide legal services to people with AIDS. And that's what really led to the formalization of having a gay bar association.
LeGaL had had a legal clinic for many, many years, many decades really, and I think we're leading the charge and contributing to the sense of helping our community and being a community.
For me, the people who come to bind their gong is Dick Fela and Hank Henry. Everyone told me it would be impossible for me to become a judge given how out I was.
After he died, people were sort of wondering as to how best to remember Hank, and I have no recollection of who came up with the idea of starting a judicial internship program and naming it after Hank. And as soon as anyone who knew Hank heard this, everyone knew that it was the absolutely best appropriate thing to do in Hank's memory and a great thing for us to do for the community, for law students.
When I first told my father that I got the Hank Henry Fellowship and then I would be sitting with multiple judges, his first response was, "How many gay judges are there?" So being a Hank Henry Fellow let me see that LGBTQ people are in all areas of practicing law.
When I joined the board, I felt like a superhero. I felt like I was in a place where I was going to be able to do something.
When we used to have our dinners, and I'm telling you, we would be afraid to guarantee that there'd be 100 attendees at the early dinners.
I still remember the first one we had way back in the mid-1980s. I wrote to my congressman. I lived on the Upper East Side at the time, so I wrote to Bill Green, who was a moderate Republican, who was a sponsor of the National Gay Rights Bill. And we invited him to be the speaker at our first dinner. And to our amazement, he accepted because we were an organization no one had ever heard of at the time. And it was in a rather small event room in a hotel, maybe 40 or 50 people there at the most.
At these small ones, someone would always get up and read off the names of whatever public figures were there. And, there were always a few. And then one year I went to the dinner and they said, the list is too long. Everyone wants to be here.
But to watch it grow to the point where we fill these enormous banquet halls with hundreds of people and law firms taking tables and buying ads in the program and everything, it's overwhelming to me to come to one of these events and see thousands of people. It's like a mighty oak growing from a little acorn.
That the progress itself doesn't mean that we're no longer relevant. Progress means that, wow, it's working and we need to continue our mission. We need to get stronger.
The last year has been really sobering, and there was a lot of talk a year ago that whether or not organizations like this still matter or still necessary, and I think we realized that these pillars of the community are still pillars and are pillars for a reason.
We're literally at a moment where we need all hands on deck. There are people in the highest levels of our federal government who want to roll back our equal dignity under the law, and it's important that the legal community, particularly the LGBT legal community, is at the forefront of the fight to resist that effort.
This isn't a battle, the battle for equality, that's going to win itself. It takes lawyers, and it takes motivated lawyers. And who better to be motivated than those of us in the LGBT community who are attorneys and who know how important winning these battles on behalf of all of us is.